Shimmering with gold yet rotting with decay, Rome in the late 15th century was a city where sanctity and sin coiled around each other like serpents. The Vatican, heart of Christendom, pulsed not only with prayer but with whispered deals, secret indulgences, and the perfume of corruption. Within these marble corridors, Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI, surveyed his dominion with the hunger of a predator, the papal tiara, encrusted with jewels and heavy with centuries of sacred authority, pressed against his brow, but Rodrigo bore its weight as a crown earned through guile. For years, he had schemed, bribed, and clawed his way toward the throne of St. Peter. Spanish gold greased the hands of wavering cardinals. Alliances were forged not by holy vows but by whispered promises in darkened chambers. By the conclave of 1492, the outcome was clear. Alexander's rise had been purchased in coin and blood. The Borgias were not noble by ancient Roman lineage, a fact their enemies never ceased to remind the city of, but their ruthlessness compensated for what their pedigree lacked. Rodrigo's court was a place transformed, not into a sanctuary of devotion, but a theater of vice. Cardinals who had once pretended at piety now presided over tables of dice and cards, fortunes made and lost in a single night. Courtesans, glittering in pearls and painted with rouge, wandered openly through Vatican halls where holy chants once echoed. At the center of this new world stood his children. Lucrezia, golden-haired, porcelain-skinned, only 16, moved through the papal palace like a living treasure, innocent in appearance, but already bartered as a pawn in her father's grand designs. Her laughter rang like silver bells through gilded halls, though those who looked closely saw the calculation behind her smiles. To her father, she was more than a daughter, she was a key, a jewel to unlock the vaults of power across Europe. Beside her loomed her brother Cesare, young, ambitious, and already cloaked in ecclesiastical robes as a cardinal. His eyes, cold as polished steel, betrayed his nature more than any title could. Rome whispered that Cesare was born for the sword, not the cassock. Those whispers were not wrong. Even before the scandals that would define their names, Rome had begun to watch the Borgias with fascination edged by fear. The papal court, once a place of sermons and scholars, became an arena where fortunes rose and fell as swiftly as a dice roll. Rodrigo's mistresses paraded like queens, his illegitimate children were raised within the Vatican's very walls, as if the Pope himself mocked the laws he was sworn to uphold. Yet beyond the marble gates, the city stirred with unease. Taverns buzzed with gossip, pamphleteers scrawled venom on cheap paper, and enemies, the Orsini, the Colonna, the Della Rovere, circled like wolves, their eyes fixed on the Vatican's fattened prey. Rome had known corruption before, but never had it worn so brazen a face, for now, though, the Borgias glittered. Frescoed ceilings and banquet halls masked the rot beneath. Yet in the corners of Rome's piazzas, in the smoky taverns and candlelit chapels, a question slithered from lip to lip, impossible to silence. What manner of family was this? What sins lay hidden behind their gilded doors? The stage was set. The players, Rodrigo, Cesare, Lucrezia, stood ready. And the world, though it did not yet know it, would never forget the name Borgia. The Vatican's marble corridors echoed with the footsteps of two figures who, though young, carried the weight of dynasties on their shoulders. Lucrezia Borgia, scarcely 16, was the jewel of her father's ambitions, a daughter shaped as much by politics as by blood. With hair like spun gold and the delicate grace of a porcelain figurine, she became the living embodiment of Rodrigo's vision, beauty wielded as a weapon. Yet behind her serene smile lurked a quickness of mind, one that learned early how to listen more than she spoke. In a world where silence could be sharper than a dagger, Lucrezia mastered the art. Her brother, Cesare, was of a different mold entirely. Raised to wear the red robes of a cardinal, his presence was more wolf than shepherd. His gaze, piercing and unflinching, made even seasoned courtiers avert their eyes. Rome whispered that he had been born for armor and steel rather than sermons, and Cesare himself seemed to believe it. Where Rodrigo ruled with cunning and gold, Cesare thrived in the realm of fear. His ambition stretched even further than his father's, not merely to control the papacy, but to carve his own kingdom from the fractured map of Italy. Together, they moved through the Vatican like twin stars in a dark sky. Lucrezia, radiant, drew admiration and envy in equal measure. Cesare, cold and calculating, inspired dread. Courtiers observed their closeness and began to murmur. The way he lingered at her side at banquets, the way she leaned toward him as if no other presence in the room existed. To some, it was the natural intimacy of siblings in a hostile world. To others, it was the seed of something far darker. But in those early years, such whispers remained only whispers. Rome had other spectacles to occupy its hunger for scandal. Rodrigo's mistresses walked openly through the Vatican's halls, their laughter spilling into sacred spaces. Banquets dazzled with roasted swans, jeweled goblets, and fountains of spiced wine. Even the Pope's enemies could not deny the splendor, though they spat with disgust at its source. And yet, as dazzling as Rodrigo's court appeared, the true theater of power lay in his children. Lucrezia was the face, Cesare the blade. Every marriage contract, every alliance, every calculated friendship passed through them. Their father's love was real, but it was not tender, it was a strategist's love. One that valued usefulness above innocence. For Rodrigo, blood was not sacred, it was currency. Rome, of course, was watching. The city had always thrived on scandal, and with the Borgias it found a feast beyond imagining. When Lucrezia strolled through the Vatican gardens with her ladies, conversations faltered, eyes darting away. When Cesare entered a chamber, silence fell as though a storm cloud had passed overhead. The Borgias fascinated because they terrified, a family not bound by the old rules of noble birth, but driven by sheer will to dominate. In the candlelit corners of taverns, men raised their cups and muttered of poisoned wine and midnight daggers. Broadsheets appeared at dawn, dripping with satire and venom. The enemies of the Borgias, the Della Rovere, the Orsini, the Sforza, watched from the shadows, sharpening their weapons not only of steel, but of rumor, for the stage of Renaissance Rome was not built solely on marble and blood. It was built on stories. And the stories of the Borgias were already beginning to coil into legend. The first whispers drifted through Rome like smoke, insubstantial at first, but suffocating once they spread. No one could say who spoke them first, only that they caught fire in the city's taverns, cloisters, and candlelit chambers. The daughter shares the father's bed. The brother's gaze lingers too long. Pamphlets began appearing overnight, crude woodcuts pressed by trembling hands, their lines thick with malice. The images were grotesque parodies, Rodrigo's heavy jowls beside Cesare's sharp, predatory features, both entwined with Lucrezia's flowing hair. The details were just vague enough to escape outright accusation, but the message was unmistakable. Beneath the drawings, prayers were twisted into obscenity. O Holy Father, who art in bed, unhallowed be thy name. Rome's appetite for scandal was insatiable. The pamphlets passed hand to hand, tucked into cloisters, read aloud in smoky taverns. Rumor did not need proof. It needed only repetition. And repetition it had in abundance. Lucrezia felt it most keenly. Walking in the Vatican gardens, she found her companions falling silent, their eyes shifting, their laughter dying mid-sentence. Servants whispered behind their hands. She was no fool. She knew what they said. But to acknowledge it would give it strength, and so she moved forward with her head high, as if silence itself were armor. Cesare responded differently. He was a wolf confronted with snarling dogs. When he traced one pamphlet to a trembling printer in Trastevere, he dragged the man into the night, pressed a dagger to his throat, and demanded to know the patron. The poor wretch stammered the name of a Sforza lackey. His corpse was found floating in the Tiber at dawn, his tongue cut out, a clear warning to others. Yet the damage was already done. A rumor, once unleashed, cannot be killed with steel. Rodrigo, for his part, dismissed it all with the wave of a jeweled hand. "Let the dogs bark," he told Lucrezia, his voice heavy with wine. "They envy what they cannot have." But his nonchalance only deepened suspicion. Why would God's vicar on earth not rage at such a monstrous slander? Unless, Rome muttered, unless the whispers had teeth, at a banquet hosted by Cardinal Orsini, a poet dared to recite verses laced with double meaning, his eyes flicking toward Lucrezia as he spoke of flowers plucked too soon. The hall erupted in stifled laughter. Lucrezia's cheeks burned, but she held her chin aloft, leaving the room with silent dignity. Only in the privacy of her chamber did she allow her rage to break porcelain, a vase shattered against the wall. Cesare found her kneeling amid the shards. He bent low, his voice like steel, "They will pay." But punishment was never enough. For scandal in Rome was not like a knife to the heart, it was a slow poison. And in the echoing halls of the Renaissance, where stories traveled faster than soldiers, the most dangerous weapon was not the sword, but the whisper that would not die. In the tangled world of Renaissance Rome, corruption was as common as incense. Cardinals sold indulgences, nobles plotted murders over their wine cups, and even popes kept mistresses whose names were known in every piazza. Rome had learned to stomach such vices, even laugh at them. But incest, that was different. That was the sin that made people cross themselves in silence, the one offense whispered only in shadows, and so, when the rumor attached itself to the Borgias, it spread with a virulence unmatched by any other scandal. Bribery. Rome could forgive. Nepotism. It was the way of the world. Murder. Even that could be rationalized as politics by other means. But incest was the corruption of blood. The betrayal of divine order itself. It was not merely immoral, it was monstrous. The Borgias were already despised for their Spanish blood, their brazen ambition, their audacity in flaunting what other families tried to hide. But with this new accusation, they ceased to be merely sinful. They became unnatural. Their enemies needed no proof. The power of the accusation lay not in evidence, but in its irresistibility. The pamphleteers understood this. One pamphlet slipped beneath the door of a Venetian ambassador depicted Lucrezia as a modern-day Phryne, her arms entwined around both father and brother. Another, recited aloud in the taverns of Trastevere, spun a grotesque tale of a papal key that opened not heaven's gates, but his daughter's chamber door. Woodcuts, crude yet suggestive, showed shadows and embraces too twisted to name. Even the sermons of priests began to drip with venom. A fiery Florentine preacher, his voice shaking with conviction, thundered of a house where the serpent nests in the marriage bed. He named no family. He did not need to. The congregation already knew whom he meant. And yet, the cruelest irony was this: the Borgias were guilty of many crimes, but not this one. Rodrigo had bought the papacy with gold and bribes, his election soaked in corruption. Cesare ordered assassinations as casually as others ordered wine. Lucrezia's hand in marriage was traded like a coin in her father's endless games of power. These sins Rome could understand, even expect. But they were not enough to destroy the Borgias. Not like this rumor could, for incest was the perfect weapon. It was the ultimate slander, one that bypassed reason and sank its claws into imagination. And in a world where truth mattered less than belief, it made the Borgias not just corrupt rulers, but abominations. The whispers slithered across Europe. From Naples to Florence, from Paris to London, stories grew in the telling. Rome, always hungry for spectacle, found in the Borgias the perfect villains. And once a family is cast as villains, every banquet, every laugh, every silence feeds the myth. In that silence, Lucrezia walked with her head high. Cesare sharpened his blade. And Rodrigo laughed. But Rome was no longer laughing with him. Rome was laughing at him. And in that laughter, the seeds of the family's ruin were sown. From the moment she could walk, Lucrezia Borgia had been less a daughter and more a golden key, one her father intended to use to unlock alliances across Italy. Rodrigo's love for her was genuine, but it was never innocent. It was the love of a strategist for his most valuable piece on the chessboard. And in a game where kingdoms rose and fell overnight, Lucrezia's hand in marriage was a weapon sharper than any blade. By the age of 13, she had already been betrothed twice. Each time, Rodrigo's eye was fixed not on her happiness but on the map of Italy, his fingers tracing territories he sought to bind under the Borgia name. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, seemed at first a promising match. The Sforzas of Milan were powerful, and their northern influence balanced the Vatican's southern interests. The wedding was a spectacle of silk and gold. Guests feasted beneath frescoed ceilings while Lucrezia, still a child, stood draped in Venetian lace, her hands clasped in those of a man twice her age. The city's nobles smiled and toasted, yet even then, whispers flickered. Was this marriage a bond of love, or merely a contract written in ink and ambition? The answer soon revealed itself. When political winds shifted and the Sforzas became less useful, Rodrigo wasted no time in unraveling the union. He declared the marriage null, not for politics, but for non-consummation. The charge was a humiliation beyond words. Giovanni was forced to sign documents confessing impotence, a manhood stripped not by sword but by shame. Whether true or false mattered little. Rome believed what it wanted to believe. Giovanni fled the city in disgrace, his honor shattered. In his bitterness, he fed the rumors already gnawing at the Borgia name. They threatened me, he cried to allies. Cesare himself put a knife to my throat. Others claimed Giovanni refused his marital bed because Lucrezia had already been claimed by another. Truth dissolved into venom, and venom into legend. Through it all, Lucrezia remained silent. Her face was composed, her words obedient. She retired briefly to the convent of San Sisto, her sudden piety only deepening suspicion. Some pitied her as a child bride abandoned, others whispered she had retreated to conceal a pregnancy. Whatever the truth, her silence allowed the city to imagine the worst. Rodrigo, meanwhile, pressed her hand into another union, this time with Alfonso of Aragon, a prince of Naples. This marriage glittered with promise. Naples was a jewel, its ports rich, its crown powerful. And unlike her first union, this one carried a fragile seed of affection. Alfonso was young, handsome, and by most accounts gentle with his bride. For a fleeting moment, Lucrezia seemed to glimpse happiness, something beyond her role as her father's pawn, but in the Borgia world, happiness was a fragile illusion. Alfonso's fate would prove darker than Giovanni's humiliation. For in Rome, love was never separate from politics, and politics was always written in blood. The heavy stone walls of San Sisto rose like a fortress against the noise of Rome. Within them, silence reigned, the hush of cloisters, the drone of prayer, the rustle of veils brushing against stone. Here, Lucrezia Borgia sought refuge, or at least the appearance of it. She arrived not in jewels and silks but in the plain will habit of a penitent, her golden hair veiled, her face pale with resignation. Rome, however, did not believe in innocence. To some, her retreat was the gesture of a pious young woman humiliated by annulment. To others, it was proof of darker secrets. Rumor twisted swiftly. Lucrezia was with child. But whose child? The annulled husband Giovanni Sforza's, conceived in that contested marriage. Or the offspring of a more terrible liaison, a child of sin too monstrous to name. The nuns of San Sisto, though cloistered, were not deaf. They murmured in the shadows about the Pope's daughter kneeling beside them in prayer. They noticed the tremor in her hands, the way her lips pressed tightly together during Mass. Some pitied her as a girl abandoned by both husband and father. Others eyed her with suspicion, certain she carried a shame that could not be spoken aloud. One night Cesare himself came to the convent, cloaked and unannounced. His presence sent a shiver through the abbess, who dared not bar his way. In the garden, he and Lucrezia spoke in low, urgent tones, their faces lit by torchlight. No one heard the words, but the sight of his hand pressed briefly against her cheek was enough to feed a dozen pamphlets. By dawn, whispers of their meeting swarmed the city. A physician arrived days later, discreet and grim. He examined Lucrezia behind closed doors, the nuns straining their ears against the wood. When he emerged, his face revealed nothing. The truth, if there was one, remained locked within those stone walls. But truth mattered little to Rome. Rumor had already decided, pamphleteers seized on the story. Broadsheets painted Lucrezia as the Virgin defiled, the Madonna turned Magdalene. Some claimed she bore a child in secret, spirited away to the countryside. Others said she had drunk bitter herbs to purge her womb, her sin erased with blood. Each tale more lurid than the last, each tale adding to the legend. Rodrigo, when pressed, laughed it off. My daughter seeks solace in God's grace. Would you deny her that? Yet even his allies exchanged uneasy glances. The timing was too perfect, the silence too calculated. Lucrezia stayed at San Sisto for months. When she finally returned to the Vatican, she was thinner, paler, but her gaze had hardened. She did not defend herself. She did not weep or rage. She walked into the lion's den with her head high, her secrets buried deep. In the Borgias world, survival was never about innocence or guilt. It was about control. And Lucrezia, at San Sisto, had learned the first lesson of power: let Rome whisper what it will. The truth is less important than the mask you wear. For a brief moment, it seemed that fate might be kind to Lucrezia Borgia. Her second marriage, arranged to Alfonso of Aragon, nephew of the King of Naples, was not only a political alliance but, astonishingly, a union touched by real affection. Alfonso was young, handsome, and gentle, so unlike the calculating men who prowled the papal court. To Lucrezia, hardened by years of being bartered like a coin, his presence must have felt like sunlight breaking through a storm. Their wedding was celebrated with dazzling splendor. Rome feasted, its tables bending under the weight of roasted peacocks, sugared fruits, and rivers of wine. Rodrigo, drunk with triumph, boasted of the power this marriage secured, with Naples allied to the papacy. The Borgias had wrapped Italy in their net. But beneath the gilded joy, enemies gritted their teeth. The Orsini, the Della Rovere, the Sforza, all watched with venomous eyes, knowing that the stronger the Borgias grew, the more dangerous the balance of power became. For a time, Alfonso and Lucrezia seemed genuinely happy. Chroniclers speak of their strolls through gardens, of music drifting from their chambers, of tenderness rare in the Borgia world. Alfonso adored her, and Lucrezia, for once, appeared more bride than pawn. Even Cesare, who regarded most men with thinly veiled contempt, tolerated his brother-in-law's presence, but politics is a tide that turns without warning. As Rodrigo shifted his alliances, abandoning Naples in favor of France, Alfonso's value to the Borgias crumbled. His presence, once an asset, became a liability. And Cesare, whose ambitions tolerated no obstacles, began to circle him like a wolf sensing blood. The end came one rain-slick night in 1500. Alfonso was found sprawled in a Roman alley, his body pierced by assassins' blades. He lingered, grievously wounded, carried into the palace where Lucrezia wept at his side, her tears staining his fevered face. She pleaded for his life, summoning physicians, praying at his bedside. For a moment it seemed he might survive. But fate, or rather Cesare, had other designs. One night, as Alfonso lay weakened but breathing, masked men entered his chamber. His throat was crushed, his final breath stolen in silence. The murder was as swift as it was cruel, and no one doubted whose hand lay behind it. Cesare's name rose in every whisper, his shadow darkening Lucrezia's grief. Rome reacted with horror. The killing of rivals was one thing, such was politics. But this was different. This was the murder of Lucrezia's husband, a man who had brought her rare happiness. If Cesare could do this, what else was he capable of? Pamphlets erupted across the city, Cesare as Cain, Lucrezia as a weeping Abel. Some went further, asking why a brother would destroy his sister's love, unless he wanted it for himself. Lucrezia's sorrow was genuine, her mourning public. She cloaked herself in black, shut herself in her chambers, rejected her father's attempts at consolation. Only once did she break her silence. At a private mass for Alfonso's soul, she turned to Cesare. Her voice a whisper, "You took him from me." Cesare's reply was cold. "I protected you." Her laughter rang bitter in the candlelight, a sound like shattering glass. "No. You only proved what they already say about us." From that night forward, the whispers of incest, once dismissed as slander, grew teeth. Alfonso's blood had sealed the myth. And Lucrezia, caught between grief and silence, stepped deeper into the shadows of legend. The Vatican glowed with candlelight, its banquet hall a theater of excess. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, gilded chalices of wine, and sugared fruits glittering like jewels. Musicians played, courtiers laughed, and Pope Alexander VI presided over it all with a smile that never reached his eyes. To the uninitiated, it was a feast of triumph. To Rome, it was something else entirely, a stage where death sometimes dined as an uninvited guest. For years, whispers had clung to the Borgias' banquets. Guests who left the table never returned home. Cardinals who crossed Rodrigo's were seen choking into their goblets, their faces ashen before they hit the floor. Nobles who had dared oppose Cesare vanished after a toast of friendship. And always, the same explanation followed: spoiled shellfish, sour wine, a surfeit of indulgence. Yet no one in Rome truly believed it. The name given to the family's invisible assassin was Cantarella, a poison said to be so subtle it left no trace, a concoction brewed from arsenic and mystery. It was said to taste of nothing, to mingle invisibly with wine or sugared cakes. To accept the Borgias' hospitality, the city murmured, was to play dice with death. One tale, retold until it became legend, spoke of a banquet where Cardinal Orsini, a longtime enemy, sat drinking and laughing until his voice faltered. He clutched his chest, his breath came ragged, and before the servants could move, he was on the floor, convulsing. The music did not stop. The dancers did not pause. Orsini's body was dragged discreetly away as if nothing had happened. 6 others died that same night. By morning, Rome knew the truth, though no proof was ever found. the Borgias had purged their table. Lucrezia's role in these tales became the subject of endless fascination. Chroniclers described her serene composure as men gasped for breath around her, how she sipped her wine with unshaken calm, her eyes betraying nothing. Was she innocent, merely playing her part as hostess? Or was she complicit, the silent handmaiden of death at her father's side? The ambiguity was irresistible, and Rome chose the darker version. The irony, of course, is that historians still debate whether these poisonings were fact or invention. Perhaps enemies exaggerated deaths from disease or excess into deliberate murders. But in Renaissance Rome, perception mattered more than reality. And the perception was this: the Borgias had turned their dining table into an altar of execution. Their goblets as deadly as daggers. In this way, their legend grew. For what family, Rome asked in awed horror, would poison its guests beneath the frescoed ceilings of the papal palace? What kind of daughter could sit smiling as men died at her feet? The answer was simple, chilling, and unforgettable: the Borgias were not like other people. They played by their own rules. And in their world, even bread and wine could become weapons. If Rodrigo Borgia's papacy shocked Rome, it was not merely because of his politics or his greed, but because he wore his sins openly, without the veil of hypocrisy. Other popes had strayed, taking discreet mistresses and fathering children quietly raised in distant palaces. Rodrigo flaunted his. He paraded them through the Vatican itself, as if daring the city to look away. Foremost among his mistresses was Venanza de Catania, a Roman matron of influence and cunning, who bore him 4 children: Cesare, Lucrezia, Giovanni, and Geoffrey. Though their romance eventually cooled, her shadow lingered long over the papal palace. But it was Giulia Farnese, nicknamed La Bella, who scandalized Rome most of all. Barely 16 when she caught the Pope's eye, Giulia became his openly acknowledged concubine. So brazen was Rodrigo's affection that artists painted her likeness as the Virgin Mary in Vatican chapels, her golden hair spilling over the shoulders of a saint. The faithful crossed themselves in outrage, whispering of blasphemy, while Rodrigo only laughed. Nor were these the only women. Rodrigo's appetites were well known, his palace echoing at night with the laughter of courtesans and the scent of perfume. Envoys wrote home in disbelief: the Pope preaches chastity by day, and defile it by night. Yet Alexander VI seemed immune to shame. He did not deny his illegitimate children; instead, he elevated them, showering them with titles and wealth. Cesare was made a cardinal before he turned 20. Giovanni was named Duke of Gandia. Lucrezia was gifted a palace of her own, its walls adorned with tapestries of nymphs and satyrs. The contradiction was staggering. Here was the man who proclaimed himself God's vicar on earth, living as if the 10 Commandments were suggestions. But what disturbed Rome even more was not the behavior itself, for vice was nothing new, but the pride with which Rodrigo displayed it. In an age where appearances were everything, he tore away the mask and reveled in his own corruption, and with each public scandal, the darker rumors gained credibility. If the Pope could so brazenly flout his vow of celibacy, why should it be unthinkable that he crossed other, more forbidden lines? The incest whispers found fertile soil in Rodrigo's shamelessness. Each time he embraced Giulia in public, each time he raised a toast to one of his bastards, Rome's imagination leapt further, until nothing seemed impossible for the Borgias. Even Rodrigo's allies sometimes recoiled. One Venetian envoy recorded in his diary how he had seen Giulia seated beside the papal throne, her hand resting lightly on Rodrigo's arm as if she were a queen. "God sees," murmured a cardinal at the sight. "God forgives," replied another bitterly, "but the people do not." And indeed, the people did not. Pamphleteers sharpened their quills, spreading tales of orgies in the Vatican, of papal feasts that blurred the line between sacred and profane. Each story, embroidered in the telling, added another layer to the myth. Rodrigo, far from silencing the rumors, seemed to feed them with every indulgence, every public display of affection. To Rome, it became clear, in the Borgia household, the laws of God did not apply. Blood came before holiness. Desire eclipsed restraint. And if Rodrigo would not honor his vows to the church, then perhaps, whispered the city, he would not honor the natural bonds of family either. The Vatican of Alexander VI was no longer the house of God but a palace of flesh and ambition. Where hymns once echoed, the laughter of mistresses rang, where solemn councils once met, banquets sprawled into the night. Rodrigo had transformed the heart of Christendom into his own stage, and he did not care who saw. At feasts, bishops sat beside courtesans, and cardinals raised goblets in toasts to Rodrigo's bastard children as though they were princes of holy blood. Giulia Farnese, La Bella, glittered in jewels as she leaned against the papal throne, her presence so brazen that chroniclers struggled to describe it without trembling with outrage. When Rodrigo celebrated the birth of yet another illegitimate child, he hosted a ball so scandalous that even hardened envoys averted their eyes. Wine flowed, dancers whirled, and when a Spanish bishop dared to mutter that such spectacle was unseemly for God's vicar, Alexander only laughed, seemly. We are all God's children, are we not? Rome gasped. For centuries, the Church had hidden its sins behind velvet curtains, speaking in the language of holiness while acting in shadows. Rodrigo tore away the veil. He mocked the hypocrisy of his predecessors by making no attempt to conceal his own. But in doing so, he fed the darkest imaginings of his enemies. If the Pope could take lovers openly, why should it be unthinkable that he took his daughter as well? If the papal throne could cradle both Christ's vicar and a teenage mistress, what boundary was sacred? Satirical verses sprang up in piazzas, poems dripping with filth, sung in the marketplaces as if they were psalms of mockery. One biting couplet whispered through Rome's streets compared Lucrezia to Persephone, dragged down not by Hades but by her own kin. Another, passed from Florence to Venice, sneered of papal keys that unlocked not heaven's gates, but a maiden's bed. The more outrageous the rumor, the more eagerly it was believed. In truth, Rome had long tolerated the vices of its rulers. But Rodrigo's shamelessness changed the game. He stripped away plausible deniability, and with it, the protective cloak of reverence. His household blurred the line between family and lovers so completely that even allies began to murmur. Pamphlets crossed borders, spreading tales of orgies in papal chambers, of feasts where Lucrezia poured wine with eyes too knowing. Of children born not in innocence but in sin. It no longer mattered whether the stories were true. In the imagination of Europe, the Borgias had become a family of monsters, the Vatican their lair. And Rodrigo, laughing with wine in his cup and mistresses at his side, seemed determined to prove them right. The summer of 1503 settled over Rome like a fever. The Tiber stank in the heat, and the city seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for a storm that had not yet broken. Within the apostolic palace, Pope Alexander VI, once so robust, so booming in his appetites, began to wither before the eyes of his court. His jowls sagged, his skin turned sallow, and the laughter that had filled his feasts grew faint, rasping, uncertain. On August 18, he dined with Cardinal Adriano de Corneto at a villa outside the city. The table was, as always, heavy with roasted pheasants, figs dripping with honey, and wines from the Pope's own cellars. But as the night wore on, those at the table saw a change. Rodrigo's appetite faltered. His hand trembled as he lifted the goblet. Sweat gleamed on his brow. By midnight, he was writhing in agony. They carried him back to the Vatican, his robes soaked with sweat, his face twisted with pain. Physicians were summoned, but their diagnoses contradicted one another. Some spoke of tertian fever, others of a surfeit of food. Yet in Rome's streets, another explanation caught like wildfire: poison. The irony was too perfect. The master of Cantarella, the Pope whose very name had become synonymous with corruption, undone by his own weapon, theories multiplied. Had the Della Rovere family, his bitterest rivals, finally struck back? Had the Orsini or Sforza slipped venom into the wine? Or had divine justice, long delayed, at last laid its hand upon him? Rome, ever eager for the dramatic, preferred the last. God has poisoned his own vicar, whispered the crowds. At last the cup of sin overflows. Cesare returned from campaign to find his father delirious, raving of demons and flames, at times calling desperately for Lucrezia's forgiveness. At other moments he cursed shadows that only he could see. Lucrezia knelt by his bedside, clutching a vial of holy water, her lips moving in prayer, but her father's gaze slid past her, wild and unrecognizing. On the third day, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Alexander VI breathed his last. The silence that followed was heavy, unnatural. For a heartbeat, it seemed the entire city paused. Then the streets erupted. Bells tolled, and crowds surged into piazzas, some weeping, many jeering, all roaring with the fierce release of fear long endured. The Pope was dead. The reign of the Borgias, it seemed, was broken. Yet inside the Vatican walls, the story was far from over. Cesare, his father's corpse not yet cold, stood stiff and unyielding. When Lucrezia reached for his hand, he did not take it. His voice was low, almost unreadable: "This changes nothing. We are still Borgias." But outside, the wolves had scented blood. The Orsini, the Della Rovere, the Colonna, families who had waited years for revenge, began to circle. The papal throne stood vacant, and with it, the power that had shielded the Borgias was gone. The walls of Rome, once gilded in their triumph, now trembled with the echoes of their enemies. Had Alexander died by poison or by God's hand? Rome would never agree. But in the alleys and markets, the verdict was already set. The Borgia Pope had met a fitting end, and the age of his family was bleeding out with him. With Alexander VI lying cold in his tomb, the Borgia Empire unraveled like a tapestry pulled apart by many hands. Cesare, once the iron fist of the family, found himself suddenly vulnerable. His power had never truly been his own. It had flowed from the papal throne, from his father's indulgence, from the fear that the Pope's son commanded armies and daggers in equal measure. Now that anchor was gone, and the tide turned swiftly against him, the enemies he had once cowed with steel and poison emerged emboldened. The Orsini, the Colonna, the Della Rovere, wolves long chained by Rodrigo's papacy, now bared their teeth. In the conclave that followed, the papal throne shifted first to Pius III, who lasted scarcely a month, and then to Julius II, the Della Rovere pope who had sworn vengeance against the Borgias for years. Julius was no subtle enemy. He declared openly that Cesare's reign of terror would end, and that the papacy would no longer be a family's inheritance. Cesare tried to hold on. He had carved his own dominion in the Romagna, raising banners and fortresses across the countryside. For a time, it seemed he might weather the storm. But betrayal followed him like a shadow. The French, once his allies, abandoned him for new bargains in Italy. The Spaniards, whose gold had once fueled his father's rise, turned their loyalty to the crown of Aragon. Without allies, without the papal blessing, Cesare's armies melted away. His fall was not dramatic, not the clash of kings he might have imagined, but the slow constriction of a noose. Captured in Naples by Gonzalo de Córdoba, the very Spanish general who had once marched at his side, Cesare was cast into a dungeon. From there he was sent to Spain, shackled like a common criminal, a warlord reduced to a prisoner. The man who had been called the terror of Italy, the Black Prince of Rome, rotted behind stone walls while his enemies feasted on the corpse of his legacy. Yet even in chains, Cesari's name carried weight. Machiavelli, who had watched him closely, would later write of him as the perfect model of ambition, ruthless, cunning, merciless, but undone by fortune. To some, he was proof of the fragility of power, how quickly a man could rise to heights unimaginable and just as swiftly be hurled into ruin. To others, he remained a monster, his downfall nothing more than justice long overdue. In 1507, fate delivered its final blow. Escaping imprisonment in Spain, Cesare joined the army of Navarre, seeking to carve a new future in yet another corner of Europe. But destiny gave him no crown, only a soldier's grave. In a skirmish outside Vienna, he fell not to a rival general, not to a grand conspiracy, but to a nameless soldier's spear. His body, once clad in silk and armor, was stripped and left for the crows. When the news reached Ferrara, where Lucrezia now lived as Duchess d'Este, she ordered a mass for his soul. Courtiers whispered of her tears hidden beneath her veil. Was she mourning the brother who had loved her too fiercely? Or the monster who had destroyed so much? Perhaps both. For in Cesari's death, the last true bond to her Borgia past was severed. The wolf of Rome, the man who had ruled with steel and terror, was gone. Not with a roar, but with a forgotten cry on a foreign battlefield. And with him, the golden age of the Borgias ended, leaving behind only whispers, pamphlets, and the myths that would outlive them all. When Lucrezia Borgia entered Ferrara as the new bride of Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, she crossed not only a city's gates but into a new life. For years she had been Rome's pawn, the Pope's daughter, Cesari's sister, the woman whispered of in taverns and pulpits alike. In Ferrara, she would attempt something else, to become her own. Her marriage to Alfonso was unlike those that had come before. He was not a lovesick poet like Alfonso of Aragon, nor a reluctant pawn like Giovanni Sforza. Alfonso d'Este was a ruler in his own right, pragmatic and steady, with little patience for scandal. When he looked upon Lucrezia, he did not see the rumors Rome had spun into legend. He saw a woman who could be loyal. A duchess who could strengthen Ferrara. I care little for gossip, he told her bluntly at the start. Only for loyalty. Lucrezia embraced the chance. No longer the ornament of her father's court, she poured her energy into her new role with fervor. In Ferrara she became patroness of poets and painters, protector of convents, a duchess whose presence steadied the city during famine and plague. She bore children, attended the cathedral daily, and opened her palaces to artists who transformed Ferrara into one of the cultural jewels of the Renaissance. For the first time, people whispered of her kindness, her charity, her devotion, but redemption is never so simple. Rome's shadow clung to her like smoke. Merchants arriving from the south brought with them pamphlets smuggled across borders, tales of poisoned banquets, of forbidden love, of children hidden in convent walls. Even in Ferrara's bright halls, masked guests at her masquerades murmured behind their feathers. Did she truly bed her brother? Did she hold a cup of poison with her delicate hands? The past, like a ghost, would not be dismissed. Alfonso, pragmatic as ever, chose not to fan the flames. When a wandering friar preached in the piazza of a scarlet woman whose sins could never be cleansed, the crowd turned their eyes toward the ducal palace. Alfonso had the friar expelled, but the words lingered. Even those who adored their duchess could not entirely silence the doubts, and yet, Lucrezia endured. Her strength was in composure. Where once she had been the pawn in Rodrigo's games, she now crafted her own mask, that of the pious Duchess, the charitable mother, the patroness of art. Portraits commissioned in her later years show her not as the temptress of rumor but as a serene Madonna, draped in silks, her gaze calm and untroubled. Still, in her private hours, she could not escape memory. When news of Cesari's death reached Ferrara, she retreated to a small chapel and lit candles for his soul. Alone, she wept, not only for the brother who had shaped her fate, but for the part of herself that died with him. For without Cesare and Rodrigo, she was free, yet freedom carried its own weight, its own loneliness. Ferrara had given Lucrezia a second life, and she embraced it. But she could never fully outrun the first. The rumors had become myth, and myths cling more tightly than truth. And so she lived, both Duchess and Borgia, saint and sinner, forever caught between reinvention and remembrance. Ferrara bloomed under Lucrezia's hand, its palaces fragrant with orange blossoms, its courts alive with music and poetry. To her subjects, she became a duchess of compassion, feeding the hungry during famine, kneeling for hours in prayer when plague swept the streets. Mothers spoke of her generosity, poets praised her grace. It was as if she had shed the poisonous skin of Rome and emerged reborn, but the past has a way of clinging, like a shadow at dusk that lengthens no matter how far one walks. For every act of charity, there was a whisper of poison. For every painting that showed her as Madonna, there was a pamphlet smuggled in merchants' carts, its ink dripping venom. Even in Ferrara, masquerades sparkled with gossip. Behind jeweled masks, guests whispered questions too dangerous to ask aloud. Was she her father's concubine? Was her brother her lover? Alfonso d'Este, pragmatic as stone, stood firm against the rumors. Once, as they walked in the palace gardens, he spoke plainly. They still talk. Lucrezia, cradling their youngest child, did not flinch. They always will, she answered. Does it trouble you? He studied her for a long moment. No. You are my wife. That is all that matters. His words were steady, but even he could not silence the gossip carried by the winds of Europe. Friars preaching in piazzas used her name as a warning, their sermons laced with fire, the scarlet woman whose sins can never be washed clean. Crowds glanced toward her palace windows, their eyes a mixture of fascination and fear. Some muttered prayers for her soul. Others smiled with cruel delight, savoring the idea that scandal clung to the Borgia name like a curse that not even marriage or motherhood could erase. Lucrezia fought back not with daggers, but with memory. She commissioned portraits of herself as a serene duchess, her children gathered about her like symbols of virtue. She endowed convents, inscribed her name in stone as patroness and protector. If Rome would not allow her innocence, she would carve her redemption in marble and paint, in works that would outlast the whispers, and yet, she was not untouched. On the anniversary of her father's death, she would retreat alone, raising a goblet of wine in silence, whispering words no one else would hear, to the house of Borgia. May its curses die with me. Still, the curses clung. The ghost of Cesare lingered in her dreams, his voice. His shadow, his fierce protection that had once been both cage and shield. Rodrigo's calculating smile haunted the edges of memory. No matter how brightly Ferrara shone, the figures of Rome's dark stage followed her like phantoms, for in truth, Lucrezia had not escaped the past. She had only learned how to live with it, as one lives with scars, invisible beneath the silk, but burning still in the silence of night. Centuries have passed since Lucrezia Borgia drew her last breath in Ferrara, since Cesari's body was left unclaimed on a battlefield, since Alexander VI's corpse was lowered into a tomb his enemies would later desecrate. Yet their shadows linger. The name Borgia still carries the weight of poison, of whispered sins, of incest and daggers in the dark. Why? Why did their legend endure when so many others, families equally ruthless, equally corrupt, were forgotten? The answer lies not only in what they did, but in what others said they did. The Borgias were guilty of bribery, of greed, of nepotism, of murder cloaked as politics. These were sins Rome could understand, even expect. But the whispers, the incest, the poisoned banquets, the unholy blurring of sacred and profane, those turned them from mortals into monsters, and monsters are never forgotten. The incest rumors, though almost certainly false, thrived because they were perfect. They carried all the qualities of enduring myth, shocking, unprovable, corrosive. In a world where the Church preached purity while drowning in corruption, nothing seemed more fitting than a pope accused of bedding his daughter. It was the ultimate indictment of hypocrisy, the sharpest weapon his enemies could wield. Truth was irrelevant. Belief was everything. Lucrezia, more than any of them, became the canvas for these stories. Was she the innocent pawn, bartered by her father, imprisoned by her brother, enduring her fate in silence? Or was she the cunning temptress, complicit in poisonings, seducing with her smile while Rome gasped? History has never agreed. She was both villain and victim, saint and sinner, her reality lost beneath centuries of rumor. The pamphlets of Renaissance Rome are dust now, their paper crumbling, their ink faded. Yet their venom lingers, staining history itself. Even today, the Borgias live not as they were, but as Rome painted them, too beautiful, too ambitious, too corrupt, too monstrous to be real. Perhaps this is their truest legacy, not the power they wielded, for it vanished with their deaths, but the stories they inspired. Stories of power unchecked, of beauty masking depravity, of a family who dared to seize the world and was punished not only with defeat, but with legend, for in the end, the Borgias remind us of a truth more unsettling than any rumor. History rarely remembers what men and women truly did. It remembers what others said they did. And in the case of the Borgias, the lies were far more irresistible than the truth, thus their myth endures, whispered like a curse, savored like forbidden wine. Not because it was true, but because it was unforgettable.